Beruchim haboim. Welcome everyone. We're about to begin Be'ezras Hashem together on Daf Samech Ches Amud Beis. Starting with Samech Ches Amud Aleph, 7 lines from the bottom. The Gemara recounts a third incident of a child on his 8th day who is to be given a bris milah on Shabbos. Says the Gemara, Hahu Yanuko di Ishtapuch Chamimei. There was a child who was being prepared for his bris milah on the 8th day on Shabbos, and the hot water that was prepared before Shabbos spilled. Omar lu Rava. Rava says, do the following. Panu li moni mi bei gavri le bei neshay. Now Rava had a house that was adjacent, that was using the chutzner, and the adjacent chutzner was where the house of the child was located. Now in the chutzner, where Rava's house was adjacent to, that had the hot water. So Rava wanted ultimately to then mevatel his reshus to that chutzner, whereby the two chatzeros that were not yet enjoined, they did not make an erev chatzeros amongst them, could go ahead and take the hot water from the adjacent chutzner of Rava to the chutzner where the child is situated and bring it to his house. So says Rava, he instructs them, again, panu li moni mi bei gavri le bei neshay. Remove, meaning move my objects from the outer part of my house, which is the men's section, to the inner part of the house where it's a women's section, more internal, more inside, in the back. What's the advantage of that? So Rav is going to explain, because when you take my objects and bring it to the Bei Nishay in the inner part of the house, so then I will not then take my objects and use the chutzner, because I'll be in the Bei Nishay, in the inner part of the house, whereby I'll mevatel my reshus to the chutzner, and then they'll be allowed to then take the hot water from my chutzner to the house in the other chutzner. And I will go to the inner part of my chutzner, the Bei Nishay, and that's where I'll be situated over the course of Shabbos, and I'll mevatel my reshus to the chutzner. Take a look at Rashi to illustrate what we're saying here. Rashi has an illustration. On the very left hand is where the child is located in the bayis, and adjacent to that child's house is the chutzner. That chutzner made an erev chatzeros, and the second chutzner next to it also made an erev chatzeros, but they did not enjoin and made an erev chatzeros together. So therefore, one cannot then metaltel from one chutzner to the other chutzner. And yet, the hot water is in the second chutzner. So Rava has an eitzah, and he says, my bayis has an outer part, the Bei Gavri, and an inner part, the Bei Nishay. I'll go and take my objects to the inner part, whereby I will not have any usage of the outer part. So I won't then go ahead and bring objects into the chutzner, and I'll go ahead and mevatel my reshus to the chutzner, and I'll remain in the inner part of my house throughout Shabbos. So therefore, in the illustration, you have again the child in the left-hand area of the illustration in his bayis. Next to that is the chutzner. Next to that is another chutzner where the water is situated, the hot water, and adjacent to that, in that chutzner, is Rava's house, both the outer area, the Bei Gavri, and the inner area, the Bei Nishay. Omar le Ravina le Rave. Ravina says to Rava, this is not going to be a possibility, because one cannot mevatel his reshus from chutzner to chutzner. So therefore, your eitzah is not going to be valid. Omar le Rava responds to Ravina, Anna Rabbi Yochanan sviruli. I hold like Rabbi Yochanan, who says, yes, you can go ahead and mevatel reshus from chutzner to chutzner. Asks Ravina, but still, v'iloi sover lo mar kishmuel. Is it not that mar, referring to Rava, is it not that you hold it like Shmuel? We're on top of Samech Ches Amud Beis at the top. Neisev mar beduchte. Let Rava, let you stay in your place, even in the Bei Gavri, and v'nevatel lehu ledidhu, and go ahead and mevatel your reshus of the chutzner. V'nahadre, in other words, keep your objects where they are, and mevatel your reshus to the chotzer, v'nahadre inu v'nevatel lehei lemar. And then after they bring the water, the hot water, from your chotzer to where the child is situated in the other chotzer, so then they'll go ahead and then mevatel back there, that section of the chotzer to you. The Ha'omar Rav, for Rav said, mevatlin v'choiz mevatlin. One can mevatel his area to somebody else, and subsequently they can mevatel it back to him. So that would be therefore an eitzah. And since Rav says that, right, that would be a way to do it. But since you do not then suggest such a way of doing it, it must believe that you don't hold like Rav. Ana beho k'Shmuel severely. And indeed you said, I hold like Shmuel. The Omar ein mevatlin v'choiz mevatlin. That one cannot go ahead and mevatel his area of the chotzer, and then afterwards they mevatel it back to him. So that's the reason why you do not then makes the suggestion, because you hold like Shmuel. Ask the Gemara, but still, v'lav chad taimu, are they not interrelated reasonings? In other words, if you hold like Shmuel, that you cannot mevatel and choizer mevatel, it also seems to imply that you also don't hold like Shmuel in regards to, you also hold like Shmuel in regards to then being not being able to mevatel v'shus mechotzer lechotzer. My taimo ein mevatel v'choiz mevatel. Why is it that you say you cannot mevatel and choiz mevatel as Shmuel does? Is it lab mishum the kivan the batle the v'shusei istalek le mehocha legamrei v'have le kiben chotzer acheres ve'im bitul v'shus mechotzer lechotzer? Is it not because that once you go ahead and mevatel your reshus, you're mistalik, you're mesulak, you're removed entirely from that chotzer, whereby then you're like a ben chotzer acheres, whereby you cannot go ahead and mevatel the chotzer because a mevatel chotzer mechotzer, which is Shmuel's reasoning. So we see that the two reasons are interrelated. If you go ahead and hold like Shmuel that you can't mevatel and choizer mevatel, it's because you hold lechara, because you can't mevatel reshus l'reshus. Says the Gemara, Marnami lo niftil. Is it not so that you cannot mevatel for that reason? And therefore, you must really hold like Shmuel indeed. Like Shmuel in the fact that you cannot be mevatel mechotzer lechotzer either. Says Gemara, no, hasam hainu time there in regards to not being able to mevatel v'choiz mevatel as Shmuel holds, is for a different reason. It's not totally on the fact that he says you cannot mevatel reshus l'reshus from chotzer lechotzer, but rather the reason is because ki heichi deloy lahavi milsi the rabbanon kechucha v'tatlulo. It's because the rabban did not want it to be a situation if you're going to have mevatel reshus and then turn around and they'll mevatel reshus back. It'll be like a joke, like a chucha v'tlula and a leitzonus. And therefore, that's why Shmuel holds that one cannot go ahead and mevatel v'choizer mevatel. Gufa, the Gemara now brings back those previous statements, the shita of Rav and Shmuel in regards to being mevatel and v'choizer mevatel. Says the Gemara, Rav omer vatlin v'choizin umevatlin, u'Shmuel omer ein mevatlin v'choizin umevatlin. Ask the Gemara, Lemo, suggest the Gemara, Lemo Rav u'Shmuel beplugto de Rabbanon, Rabbi Eliezer kamifligi. Now there was a machloikis earlier on Daf Chavtes Amud Beis, that when it comes to somebody who's mevatel his chotzer, whether he's also including in those words also his mevatel the bias, or do we say no, he's mevatel the chotzer and he's not necessarily mevatel his bias? So the Gemara says that's the machloikis in Rabbanan and Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbanan say he's mevatel the chotzer, but not mevatel his bias at the same time. Whereas Rabbi Eliezer says, if he's coming to mevatel his chotzer, then included in those words is a bittul of his bias. So Gemara now wants to suggest that the machloikis between Rav and Shmuel, whether you can mevatel v'choizer mevatel or not, is totally on the machloikis tanoim between the Rabbanon and Rabbi Eliezer as follows. The Rav the Omar Rabbanon, the Rav holds like the Rabbanon, u'Shmuel the Omar Rabbi Eliezer, and Shmuel holds like Rabbi Eliezer. Omar loch Rav. Now, what's the suggestion? That since Rav holds you can be mevatel v'choizer mevatel, that must be like the Rabbanon. Why? Because if you're mevatel v'choizer umevatel, So like the Rabbanan say that when you were mevatel your chotzer, you were not mevatel your bias at the same time. So therefore, it must be that you still have shaychis to this chotzer, whereby you can go ahead and be chayzer and mevatel. Whereas, according to Rabbi Eliezer, since when you're mevatel the chotzer, you're also mevatel the bias, it must be that you do not have shaychis to this chotzer, whereby you cannot go ahead and be chayzer mevatel, as Shmuel holds. That's a suggestion. Omar lach Rav. Rav would say, no, ano kedamre afilu Rabbi Eliezer. I can say even according to Rabbi Eliezer, who says when you go ahead and mevatel your chotzer, you're also included in that, meaning mevatel your bias. Because ad kan loy ka Omar Rabbi Eliezer hasom hamavat reshus chatzeira reshus beiso bitul mishum de bayis beloy chotzer lo dairi inchi. Because a person, he does not want to then live in a house without the rights to the chotzer. So therefore he says that when a person is mevatil the chotzer, he's not mevatil the bayis. Aval le'inin istaluke mi omar. But in regards to removing himself entirely, who says that he does that? And therefore, indeed, Rav says, I can hold even like Rabbi Eliezer. Ushmuel amar ano de'amri afilu kirabonon. And Shmuel, who says that I hold you cannot mevatel v'choyz mevatel, says I can even hold like the Rabbanan, that when you're mevatel your chotzer, you're not mevatel your bias, as follows. Because ad kan loy ka'amri Rabbanan hasom elo my de botil lo botil. They only said that when you're mevatil the chotzer, you're mevatil chotzer alone and not mevatil the bias with it. Aval my de botil mia istalik legamre. But once you are mevatil, you go ahead and misalik, you go ahead and remove yourself entirely from that chotzer. So therefore, indeed, once you move yourself entirely from the chotzer, you cannot be chayzer mevatil, as Shmuel says. Says the Gemara, Omar Rav Acha Bar Chana, Omar Rav Sheshis, the name of Sheshis. Another suggestion how Rav and Shmuel is a machlokes tanoim. In the following machlokes tanoim, the katanoi, Misha Nosan Rishuso Voitzio Ben Beshogim B'Mezi, one who is mevatil his rishus in a chotzer, and then he goes ahead and takes an object from the chotzer to his bias or vice versa, whether he did so b'shogeg, inadvertently, or b'mezid, oiser divrei meir. Then he oisers the b'nei chotzer to use that chotzer, whether again it was b'shogeg or b'mezid. That's the words of Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Yehuda oimer. Rabbi Yehuda says b'mezid oiser, b'shogeg ein oiser. Only b'mezid is he oiser if he takes an object b'mezid from the bias to the chotzer. Then we say that he is no longer, he's then going to oiser the b'nei chotzer from using that chotzer. But if he did so b'shogeg, he's not oiser. So we have machlokes in Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda. Once one is mevatel his reshus, if he b'shogeg takes an object from the chotzer and brings it to his bias or vice versa, was that going to then, with that act, going to oiser the b'nei chotzer or not? My lab behokem mifli, is it not in the following that they are arguing? The mar sover mevatlim v'choyzim vatlim. That Rabbi Meir, he holds that one who is mevatel can choyzer or mevatel, and therefore, if b'shoigeg he went ahead and carried an object, we see that he still has shaychis to this chotzer, and therefore he's able to then go ahead and oiser the b'nei chotzer. Umar sover ein mevatlin v'choyzim mevatlin, whereas Rabbi Yehuda holds that you cannot be mevatel v'choyzim mevatel, because once indeed that you went ahead and were mevatel your reshus, so you're mesulak, and therefore if b'shogeg you went and took the object, then you're not going to oiser on the b'nei chotzer. Now, even Rabbi Yehuda would agree if it's b'mezid, then you are oiser. Why? Because if b'mezid you took it, it shows that you never really were mevatel reshus. Since you didn't make a mechira, when you were moicher, it wasn't a true mechira. Therefore, it's going to be considered to be something that b'mezid will be oiser. Says the Gemara, Omar Rav Acha bar Tachlifa Mishmei de Rava. Rav Acha bar Tachlifa in the name of Rava says, Loi. This is not the machlokes between Rav and Shmuel, because the Kuli Amma ein mevatlin v'choiz mevatlin. Everybody agrees that you cannot be mevatel v'choizer and mevatel. V'hocha bekansoi shoygeg atu mezi kamifli. They're arguing about whether the shoygeg is oyser on the bnei chotzer or not. Why? Whether you hold that if you are going ahead and taking an object, like Reb Meir says, you'll be oyster on them. That's because we are afraid that you might come to do that b'mezid. So we make a knas that even b'shoigeg, if you do that, you will be oyster b'nei chotzer, as not to then come to do that b'mezid. Whereas Rabbi Yehuda is not making that gezei or that knas, and therefore he says that only if it's b'mezid is it oyster, but b'shoigeg is not oyster. Ma'asav knosser shogeg otu mezid, ma'asav lo knosser shogeg otu mezid. The Gemara now goes back and says, according to Rav Ashi, that the same way that we want to explain the machlokes in Rav and Shmuel initially, that's how Rav Ashi holds is the way to explain it. Rav Ashi Omar, Rav Shmuel beplukto, the Rabbi Eliezer Rabbona kamifliki. He holds that indeed the first suggestion that Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbanan, who are arguing about when you're mevatel echotz, do you include also the bais or not? That's the machlokes between Rav and Shmuel.